When I was just starting to build my business, no one believed that I would succeed. I had no connections, no big money. The only thing I had was the desire to prove to myself that I was capable of achieving something. I worked in construction, then as a loader in a supermarket, saving every penny, giving up unnecessary expenses, saving for years for my first small grocery store. I dreamed of opening it in a residential area, where there was always a lack of a normal place to shop, where residents were forced to travel far for groceries, and I understood that there would be demand. But the hardest thing was convincing the landlord to give me space, because he saw me as a guy with no experience and connections, who, in his opinion, would go broke in the first year. But I insisted, provided calculations, took on any part-time work to show solvency. And in the end he agreed. Then the hardest part began, because the space was in terrible condition. I did the repairs myself nights and weekends. I carried building materials myself, laid tiles. I plastered the walls, put up shelves, hired a minimal number of workers, only when I couldn't cope on my own. And all this lasted for several months. There wasn't enough money. I had to borrow from friends. But I didn't ask anyone from my family for help, because I knew they would immediately start thinking that the store was a common cause, and I wanted it to be only mine. Because every day of my life, every drop of effort was invested. The opening of the store became an event for me that I remember down to the smallest detail. The first clients, the first money earned, the first mistakes. And that's when the real struggle began, because suppliers didn't always keep their promises. I had to stand in warehouses from morning until night, knock down normal prices, return damaged goods, quarrel and learn on the go. But I held on, and gradually things got better. I hired a couple of sellers, set up accounting. The store began to bring in a stable income, not huge, but enough to live peacefully, develop the business, and already think about the future. However, at that very moment, when it seemed that life was starting to get better, a new problem appeared that I couldn't predict it. It turned out to be my own family. They suddenly started treating the store as if it was their personal pantry. At first it seemed harmless. My brother came in and took a couple of bottles of water and a pack of cookies, said that he would give them back later, but of course he didn't. Then my mother started coming and taking the groceries, explaining that she was my mother and she didn't need to be paid. My father generally said that the store was a common family business, although he never helped me with a penny. Then it got worse. My sister started coming with her friends and filling whole bags of food. Sometimes she didn't even warn me. She just went up to the sellers and said that she could take everything, because she was the owner's sister. At first I tried to turn a blind eye to this. I thought that it was temporary, that they themselves would understand that they were going too far. But the more I kept silent, the more impudent they became. At some point I noticed that the shortage at the cash register began to grow. The sellers complained that the family comes and demands to sell the products for free, and if someone refuses, they begin scandals. Once my mother threw a tantrum right in the store because the seller did not give her meat without payment. She called me and screamed that I was disgracing the family, that the money was a pity for my mother. Although I understood perfectly well that it was not about money, but about respect for my work. And I felt how anger was building up inside me, because I had fought for so many years to get back on my feet, and now the people closest to me act as if I owe them. I tried to explain calmly, said that the store is a business, not a free kitchen, that I have to pay salaries to employees, rent, taxes, that if this continues, the store will close. But no one listened to me. They were offended, accused me of greed, said that I forgot my family, that I became selfish. One day my father directly said that I am obliged to feed all my relatives, because without my family I would not have achieved anything, although in fact none of them took a single step to help me. I found myself in a situation where I was afraid every day I went to the store because I knew that new conflicts awaited me there, that the salespeople were complaining about my relatives again, that there wasn't enough money in the cash register again, and the worst thing was that I began to feel guilty. Although in my mind I understood that it wasn't me who was to blame, but the pressure was so strong that it became difficult for me to breathe. I came home and couldn't relax. I was constantly thinking about what to do next, how to set boundaries, how to explain to my family that I no longer intended to tolerate this kind of attitude. But I understood that any decision I made would lead to a scandal and a break in the relationship, and yet I could no longer tolerate it. After another scandal, when my sister and her friends took away almost a whole basket of groceries, and the numbers at the cash register didn't add up again. I realized that talking was no longer working, no matter how much I tried to explain that the store is a business, that I don't print money. Everything was useless. And then I had an idea that I thought about for a long time. I decided to install hidden cameras to have evidence, because while I was speaking with words, my relatives pretended not to understand. And if I had recordings, they would no longer be able to get out of it, of course. I understood that this was a step that could completely ruin the relationship, but I saw no other way out. I made an agreement with a company that installs video surveillance systems. We did everything carefully. The cameras were installed so that they were not immediately visible. The sellers knew, but did not tell anyone. I explained to them that this was not against them, but for the sake of restoring order, because they were tired of the family's lawlessness no less than I was. And so the first days of observation began. I sat at home and watched the recordings. And what I saw, it knocked the ground out from under my feet. One evening my mother came to the store. The seller politely asked her to pay for the groceries. She waved her hand in displeasure and began to put away meat, fish, cereals. And when the seller tried to explain again, my mother started screaming that her son was the owner and that she would take whatever she needed. And if the seller opened his mouth again, she would be fired. After that, she calmly left with full bags, without even looking at the cash register. The next day, my sister came in, and I saw her handing out sweets, chips, juices to her friends, laughing and saying, "Take it, it's all ours. We don't have to pay here." My friends laughed joyfully. As if they were at a party, the sellers stood to the side and were afraid to intervene, because they had already faced rudeness and threats from the family. I clenched my fists, looking at the screen, and felt the anger choking me. But I waited. I was collecting material. I wanted to save up enough to then present everything at once. And a week later, my father was caught on camera. He came in the evening, when there was almost no one in the store, walked past the checkout, took meat, alcohol, cigarettes, and on the way out told the seller that there was no need to write it all down. Since it was his share, I was furious, because I knew perfectly well that my father had not invested a penny in this store. And hearing the word share from him was unbearable. I got the feeling that they all simply decided that the store is a free refrigerator where you can take whatever you want, and I will be silent and smile. And the more I watched these recordings, the more I became convinced that it was time to act. I collected all the videos, made copies, and one evening invited the family to my home. I said that we need to have a serious talk when they gathered. I turned on the TV and started the recordings. My mother, sister, father appeared on the screen one after another. You could see how they took groceries, arguing with the sellers, leaving without paying, the room filled with heavy silence. I looked at their faces, and it looked like a performance. My mother tried to be indignant at first, like, "Why am I filming them?" My sister snorted and said that it was all nonsense. My father frowned and said that he had the right, because he was the head of the family, but I did not give them a chance to turn around. I said clearly that this would not continue anymore, that the store is my business, my life, that if they want groceries, then let them buy like everyone else, and if someone tries to take goods without paying again, I will contact the police. I saw how they exchanged glances. No one expected such harshness from me. My mother tried to play on pity, said that I put money above family, that I was betraying my parents. My sister left, that I had become a stranger. My father said that I was an ungrateful son, but I did not back down. I repeated the same thing. The store is a business, and if you want me to help you, ask directly, and don't take it away secretly. Everything inside me was burning. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would jump out of my chest. But I held on because I understood that if I gave in now, all my efforts would be in vain. And then my father said that I was stingy with giving my family a piece of bread. And if so, he would not recognize me as his son. My mother was crying. My sister demonstratively slammed the door and left, and I was left sitting in front of the screen with the recordings turned off and thinking that maybe I had just lost my family. But at the same time, I felt a strange relief, as if I had finally freed myself from the chains that had been holding me all this time. Because for the first time, I told them the truth and set boundaries that had not existed before. But I understood that the consequences were still to come, and that now the family would look for new ways to put pressure on me, which meant that the real fight was just beginning. After that conversation at home, when I showed the family the recordings and set strict conditions. Several days of silence followed. None of my relatives showed up either in the store or at my place. I already began to think that maybe they really understood that I was serious, that I was ready to stand to the end. But the calmness turned out to be deceptive. Very soon a new wave of problems began. Only now it was much more serious than just a shortage of goods. One morning, coming to the store, I heard from the seller that my aunt, my mother's sister, came in yesterday and made a scandal. She shouted that I offended my mother, that I was a shame to the family, that if not for my parents, I would not have taken a step in life. The seller tried to explain that I was not there, that it would be better to come later, but my aunt got carried away, waving her arms and telling all the customers that I had a heart of stone, that I forgot who raised me. And now for the sake of money, I was ready to cross out my relatives. I was ashamed in front of people who came just to buy bread and milk, and instead became witnesses of a family drama. And this was only the first call. Soon other relatives began to come to the store, uncle, cousins, even distant ones, with whom I hardly communicated. Everyone considered I needed to express a complaint to me. Some spoke calmly, some aggressively, but the meaning was always the same. I have an obligation to my family. I have no right to refuse my mother and father. I must give away food for free, because it is sacred. One cousin said directly that if he had a store, he would feed the whole family, and that I am a disgrace to the male gender. I listened to this and felt how anger and despair merge into something, because arguing with them was useless. They decided in advance that I was an enemy. I realized that my parents began to gather allies around themselves to put pressure on me collectively. And soon this was confirmed, because my mother called and said that on Saturday there would be a family council in the house, that I was obliged to come and explain myself in front of everyone. And I knew that if I refused, they would spread it among all their friends that I did not even want to talk, which meant they would ruin my reputation even more. I decided to go. But inside I was preparing for the worst when I arrived. Almost all the relatives had gathered at my parents' house, about 15 people, sitting in the living room as if in court, my mother and father at the head, my aunt nearby. My uncle poured himself some tea. One of the brothers was filming on his phone. Although he pretended that he was just holding it in his hands, the atmosphere was heavy. My father started right away. He said that I had humiliated my mother, that I had put the recordings on the screen, as if she were a thief, that I had insulted the family, and now I should apologize and return everything to the way it was. I calmly replied that the store is my business, and that I had not insulted anyone. I simply showed the facts, that I cannot allow people to take products for free, because the employees and customers suffer from this. And as a result, the store may close, but they did not want to hear. My aunt screamed that the money had gone to my head. My uncle declared that I was a disgrace to the family. My sister added that I have no heart, and that I am not a person, but a meter reader who thinks only about profit. It seemed to me that they had prepared in advance, distributed the roles. Who would say what? Because every time I tried to explain, they interrupted me, shouted me down, didn't let me finish. I saw my mother sitting there with the look of a martyr, secretly wiping away tears, and my father looking at me with cold anger. And gradually I realized that this advice was not meant to find a solution, but to break me morally, force me to admit my guilt and reopen the store doors for all my relatives. But I wasn't going to give in, and then they started making threats. My uncle said that I could have problems with suppliers because he had acquaintances. My sister threatened to tell all my friends and clients how greedy and inhumane I was. My father said directly that if I didn't change my mind, then I was no longer a son. My mother added that she wouldn't come to my wedding and wouldn't babysit my grandchildren. I listened to all this and felt that something was breaking inside me, because these weren't just words. It was pressure on the weakest points, on my family, on my guilt, on my future. I understood that if I gave in now, then later I would never be able to defend my boundaries. And then I stood up and said that if for them love for my son is measured by the number of free bags of groceries, then maybe they never really loved me, that I am not obliged to feed all my relatives, that everyone has hands, a head and the opportunity to earn money, and that I will not allow anyone else to ruin my work. I said this loudly, drowning out the shouts. I saw how their faces darkened. Someone got angry. Someone laughed in my face, but I did not stop. I said that if at least one of them once again tried to take the goods without payment, I would contact the police. And I do not care whether it is my mother or my father. I am ready to go to the end. Because I have no other choice. After these words, there was silence. They did not expect that I would say such a thing directly. My aunt jumped up and left. Slamming the door, Uncle, he muttered that I would still regret it. My sister burst into hysterics. My mother turned away. My father was silent. I turned around and left without waiting for the end of the meeting. Outside, I breathed in the cold air and felt myself shaking. My hands were shaking. But at the same time, there was a feeling that I had taken the right step, because I finally did not give in. I understood that now it would be even harder, that they would take revenge. They would try to turn all my acquaintances, clients, neighbors against me. But I also understood that this was the only way to save myself and my store. Because if I broke down now, I would lose not only the business, but also my self-respect. I walked home and thought that a new war awaited me ahead, and that perhaps the people closest to me would become my main enemies. After I left that so-called family council, I hoped that they would calm down for a while, that they would at least give me a break, but it soon became clear that no one would give me peace. A few days later, I noticed that fewer regular customers were coming to the store. Those who used to come in almost every day suddenly began to disappear. And then one of my acquaintances in the neighborhood came up to me and asked me directly if it was true that I kicked my mother out of the store and was rude to my father. I was taken aback, asked where he got that from, and then he said that he heard from my aunt, who told the neighbors that I had become greedy, that money was more important to me than my parents, that I not only forbade them to take groceries, but also humiliated them in front of everyone, allegedly throwing them out the door empty-handed. I was shocked by how far they went, and I realized that the rumors had already spread throughout the neighborhood, because that same day several customers came into the store, looked at me sideways and whispered among themselves. I felt the air become thick, as if all eyes were on me, and it was unbearable. Soon the sellers began to complain that some customers began to speak rudely. One woman directly said at the checkout that she did not like buying groceries from such a heartless person, that she would rather go to another store, and this despite the fact that I did not do anything bad to anyone, but simply set boundaries with my family. But in the eyes of people, everything looked different, because they heard only one side, tearful stories of my mother and loud accusations of my father. And my explanations were of no interest to anyone. My aunt, as it turned out, launched a whole campaign. She called relatives, friends, neighbors, and retold this story, of course, each time adding dramatic details. Then I allegedly yelled at my mother, then allegedly said that she was nobody to me, then even pushed my sister. Although this never happened, the further, the scarier it became, because people willingly believed in this picture, because it is always easier to believe the worst than to figure out the truth. And my father got his friends involved, with whom he played dominoes in the yard, and they also began to spread rumors. Someone said that I was building a business on the bones of the family. Someone claimed that I was getting rich on the grief of others. And someone generally spread complete nonsense that I was selling expired goods and deceiving customers. For me, this was a blow stronger than all the previous conflicts. Because if before I fought only with relatives, now the street, the neighborhood, the clients began to turn against me. And without clients, any store is doomed. I understood that if the rumors continued to spread, then my business would simply collapse, and all my years of work would be in vain. I tried to talk to people, explain, but it almost did not help. Those who wanted to believe the rumors believed. Those who wanted to stay away from me left. One day, an elderly neighbor, whom I respected since childhood, came into my store and said, "You know, son, you certainly the owner, but offending parents is a sin. That's what I'll tell you." And she left without even buying bread. And then I realized that the situation was getting out of control. I saw how revenue was falling, how employees were starting to get nervous because they heard the dissatisfaction of customers. I felt that if I didn't do something urgently, then the business would end. But what could I do against rumors? Against a whole army of relatives who day and night poured dirt on me. One evening I heard several men at the entrance discussing me. They laughed and said, "Look, he built a store and now he kicked out his mother for a penny. Handsome. What can I say?" I walked past and pretended not to hear. But inside everything was boiling. I thought about how low people who call themselves relatives can fall. And for what? For free food, for a pack of sausage and a kilogram of sugar. They are ready to destroy the reputation of their own son and brother. At some point I thought, maybe it's worth close the store and move to another area. Start from scratch where no one knows about me and my family. But then I remembered how much work I put into this place, how many nights I spent without sleep, how much money and effort I spent, and I realized that I will not run away. If I leave now, it will mean that they have one, that my whole life will be built on their terms. And then I decided to take a different path. I started collecting feedback from clients whom I helped, whom I gave discounts to, whom I went to meet. I asked them to write a few words on social networks, tell their friends that my store is honest and that I always kept my word. Fortunately, there were such people, and gradually their voices began to drown out the lies. But the family did not sit idly by either. They increased the pressure. One day my mother called me and said, "Are you satisfied? The whole neighborhood says you're a monster. It's your own fault. You brought us to this." And at that moment, I realized that the most important thing for her wasn't the truth, not the relationship, but only her power over me. She wanted me to give in, to come to her on my knees and beg for forgiveness. But I knew that if I did that, it would be the end of everything. One day, a group of people I hadn't seen before came into the store. They started loudly discussing how shameless I was. One of them said, "With an owner like this, the store will soon close, and rightly so," and they left without buying anything. The salespeople looked at me with anxiety. I saw the question in their eyes. How much longer can we go on like this? And I didn't know what to answer, but inside I was becoming more and more determined that I wouldn't let them destroy what I had built, even if I had to resort to the most drastic measures. I understood that the war was only gaining momentum, and the worst was yet to come. I went to a lawyer not because I wanted to start a war, but because I realized that if I didn't put everything on a legal basis, then any step I took would be used against me, and then there would be nothing left, no store, no peace of mind. The first thing I did was make an appointment at a small private law firm recommended to me by an old friend. While I was sitting in the waiting room, I thought about how strange it was. I used to dream of the day when I could manage my own life, and now I was ready to go to court against my own family. The lawyer came in calm, without unnecessary emotions, listened attentively to my story and did not interrupt. There was no surprise on his face, as if he had seen this before. I told him about the hidden cameras, showed copies of the recordings, explained how relatives systematically took goods without payment, how my aunt and other relatives spread rumors, how clients began to leave. He nodded and said that there were several directions in which one could act immediately. The first was documentary confirmation of the facts. Recordings with cameras, employee testimony, inventory and cash register reports. The second is an official statement to the police about systematic theft and pressure. The third is a civil lawsuit to protect business reputation in the event that rumors cause real damage to the business. The fourth is the formalization of strict rules for access to goods and the creation of written agreements with employees on the procedure for dispensing goods. The lawyer also warned that I need to be prepared for emotional blows and that the family can file counter-complaints to discredit me. He said that in such cases, personal and legal matters are often mixed, and that is why it is important not to resort to extreme measures that can be interpreted against me. I listened and wrote down. Thoughts swarmed in my head about how all this would look in practice. The lawyer suggested several practical steps at once. Properly register all the evidence so that the camera recordings are certified. Obtain written explanations from the seller's recording cases when relatives left without paying. File a police report indicating the dates and the amount of damage. And if necessary, prepare an appeal to the court demanding that the slander be stopped and compensation for damages be paid. But the main thing is to act calmly and according to the law, without emotional attacks. Because any drastic steps can be used to my detriment. After the reception, I felt relief. For the first time, I had a plan, and this plan did not depend on someone else's will. It was based on facts and the law. That same evening, I gathered the sellers and gave them instructions. Record all cases, make written notes, notify about every conflict. I promised that no one would lose their job because of this, but asked for honesty and discipline. The sellers took this seriously because they themselves were tired of the pressure. They knew that if they did nothing, then first of all they would lose their jobs. While we were getting the documents in order, I went to the police station and wrote a statement about theft, attaching copies of the video and reports from the cash register. The police officer who took the statement looked tired, but wrote everything down and said that an investigation would be carried out. I understood that the police are not an instant solution, but it is an official step that creates a legal basis. In a few days, we had to meet with the lawyer again. He prepared a lawsuit to protect business reputation, and a notice for my family demanding that slander and public accusations stop. The letter was written in a strict, professional manner. There was no emotion, only references to facts and a request to stop illegal actions. I gave the letter to my mother and father personally and left a copy with my aunt, which was the one who was the biggest rumor monger. The reaction was predictable. My mother burst into tears. My father said it was too much. My aunt shouted that I was threatening the whole family. But a legal document does its job. It transfers the conflict to the legal realm, where emotions lose their power. At the same time, a lawyer recommended making changes to the store's operations to minimize the potential for abuse. We introduced strict rules. No free products without the owner's written permission. The buyer must go through the checkout. If an attempt is made to take out an item, the seller immediately calls me or records the event. The accounting system was revised. Checklist procedures were added for receiving goods. Additional cameras were installed so that recording covered the entire sales floor and the exit. But all of this was no longer just security measures. These were steps to restore trust among customers and employees. After a series of formalities, I felt that I was taking control of the situation, but the lawyer warned me. Sometimes legal steps only exacerbate the conflict and stimulate retaliatory actions. So you need to be prepared for the fact that relatives can increase pressure, file counterclaims, or continue the harassment through social networks and acquaintances. And it was true. A few days after filing the documents, my aunt organized a new round of pressure. She began leaving notes at the entrances, spreading information in chats that the owner of the store was ignoring the elderly and not giving them bread. We recorded this and brought it to the lawyer. He advised preparing countermeasures. Collecting real testimonies from customers who confirmed that the store is honest. Preparing a press release with my version of events and with the facts. And if necessary, going to court to restore my business reputation. The process turned out to be exhausting. I began to spend time on meetings with the lawyer, collecting documents, and it demanded a lot mentally. But there were also unexpected positives. Some customers, having learned about my struggle, took my side, came and said that they would support the store. This gave me strength. The lawyer, seeing that moral support was growing, began to prepare a claim for damages for the period when revenue fell due to slander. But he also suggested less rigid mechanisms. Mediation, inviting a neutral third party to try to resolve the conflict peacefully. I understood that the court is a long way, and even a victory will not necessarily restore the trust of all clients. Mediation promised a chance to save the relationship in the family, albeit strained. But it required the willingness of both parties to sit down at the table and discuss the terms. I knew that my mother and father were unlikely to agree to this, because their behavior was fueled not only by grief, but also by the desire to maintain control. Nevertheless, I agreed to try because I did not want to completely sever all ties. In the preparatory process, the lawyer gave me valuable advice. Do not publish profane comments on social networks. Do not get into squabbles. Do not give interviews in an emotional state, because all this could be used against me. He insisted that I remain calm and consistent, act only through official channels. And it was difficult, because when relatives appeared in the store again, when the sellers talked about new provocations, I wanted to respond harshly, but I held back, because I understood that emotions are not a tool now. They can destroy everything. One weekend, a lawyer held a mediation, inviting my mother and father, aunt, sister, and me. The meeting took place in a neutral room. A professional mediator asked questions, asked me to describe the facts, emotions, expectations. I explained that I wanted to save the business, but I could not put up with theft and slander. My mother spoke about her feelings, about the pain for her children, about how she felt betrayed. My aunt demanded punishment for the salespeople, and my sister simply remained silent. At some point, the discussion reached a dead end, but the mediator proposed a compromise. The family receives a small limit of products per month on a family card with transparent accounting. Everything else is at full price, while penalties for exceeding the limit were prescribed. Such conditions were a compromise between my interests and the desire of the family to feel taken into account. I did not immediately agree. It felt like a concession to stubbornness. But the lawyer said that a compromise could stop the reputational damage and restore the store's operations. In the end, the agreement was signed. The family card appeared. I manually controlled the issuance of this card in the presence of 2 employees, and with an entry in the log, the first days after such an agreement were uneven. Some relatives tried to break the rules, but these were already obvious violations, and now I had written evidence in addition. Customers gradually stopped leaving. Some rumors died down, but relations with relatives did not return to their previous course. It was clear that trust was destroyed, and it would be difficult to restore it. Nevertheless, legal measures gave me space to work. The store continued to operate. The employees stopped being afraid, because they knew that I had legal support, and I learned by keeping my distance and no longer bringing family drama into the workplace. I eventually realized that sometimes protecting your boundaries through the law isn't a betrayal of your family, but the only way to preserve yourself and what you've built with your own hands. Although the price for this was high, it allowed the store to survive and gave me a chance for a peaceful life in the future. After mediation and all these legal steps, I realized one simple thing. The family does not have and will not have the support I was hoping for, and no matter how much I explain, no matter how much I prove, it will all remain in vain, because they see me not as a person, but as a source of profit. And when I finally realized this, something inside me switched. I stopped trying to convince them, stopped hoping that one day they will understand and come to ask for forgiveness. I stopped living by expectations and began to live by the rules that I set for myself. The first rule is that the store and the family now exist on different planes. No relatives have access to the warehouse, the cash register, or the hall without payment. No exceptions and no persuasion, even if the mother cries, even if the father yells, even if the aunt threatens with new rumors. I no longer involve emotions in business. The second rule is no talk about the store at the family table. If I suddenly have to be at a holiday or a meeting, then everything that concerns work. I keep the door closed. I began to speak dryly and detachedly. If they tried to provoke me into an argument, I just got up and left. At first they reacted violently, made scenes, accused me of coldness and betrayal. But over time they realized that I was no longer the one who rushed to justify and defend my decisions. The third rule, self-respect, is more important than imaginary peace. I realized that their peace and quiet had always been built at my expense, on my work, and on my willingness to forgive everything. But this resource was exhausted. And I was no longer going to sacrifice myself for the sake of other people's comforts. Yes, at first it was hard. My mother called and sobbed, asked not to be a stranger. My father once came to the store, stood at the door and left without even looking me in the eyes. My aunt continued to throw mud out of habit, but all this stopped affecting me. I perceived their words as a background, like the noise outside the window that you don't pay attention to, because that you understand. You have more important things to do. The store began to revive during this time. Customers returned. People saw that the quality had not dropped, that the rumors were empty words. And with each month, trust grew. The sellers also noticed the changes. They were no longer afraid that one of their relatives would burst in and cause a scandal. They saw that now there was order and discipline in the store, and this gave them confidence. One day, one of the saleswomen came up to me and said that for the first time in a long time she felt calm at work. And these words were more important to me than any recognition from my family. I realized that everything I did was not in vain. But inside there was a long process of restructuring. I learned to let go of what used to keep me trapped. I learned to live without their approval, learned not to wait for a call, not to hope for reconciliation. And over time it stopped being pain. It became a habit. I built a wall, and this wall did not press but protected. One evening I was sitting in the store after closing. It was quiet outside the window. A soft light was burning in the hall, and I thought about how everything had changed. I used to imagine the store as a common cause, as a place where the family could unite, where we would work together. But it turned out the opposite. The store became a dividing line, a border. But it was thanks to this border that I was able to save myself. At some point, I even began to thank fate for the fact that this whole story happened. Because without it, I might have remained a hostage to other people's demands and greed for the rest of my life. But this way, I learned the most important thing: to value my work and protect it, even from those closest to me. The relationship with my mother and father never improved. We rarely saw each other. Conversations were superficial. My aunt continued to go among the neighbors. My sister kept aloof, but it didn't destroy me anymore. I accepted that they are like that, and I can't change them, but I can change my life. The store became for me not just a business, but a symbol of this new life, a symbol of the fact that I can stand up for myself, that I know how to build and preserve, even at the cost of pain, even at the cost of loneliness, but with a sense of self-worth. And when I finally understood this, real peace came. I no longer looked for excuses, no longer was afraid of condemnation, no longer expected love from where it never existed. I simply lived and worked, developed the store, made plans for the future, thought about expansion, about new projects. And for the first time in a long time, I looked forward, not back. And this was my personal ending. I saved the store, saved myself, and learned to keep my distance, which became my main salvation.